At least we have Theoria Francos. She's a professor, writer, and organizer based in Providence. She's the author of Resource Radicals and co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Both great books, check them out. She currently serves on the DSA Green New Deal campaign committee as well. And now I'll jump right into our discussion questions so you can hear from these amazing panelists. We did get a little bit of a late start, but hopefully we'll have some time for audience questions towards the end. So the Green New Deal as a slogan has been around for a while in different forms and conceptions, being championed by the likes of Thomas Friedman, the Green Party, and most famously, our very own AOC with the Green New Deal resolution introduced in Congress in 2019, and again earlier this year with a few updates. As DSA, we made a campaign for a radical Green New Deal an organizational priority at the 2019 convention. But some on the left say the Green New Deal is inherently capitalist, can't work, is driven by liberal NGOs, etc. What does the Green New Deal mean to you, and what drew you to this work? Sydney, we'll start with you.
Sure, and thank you so much. It's so glad to be here with you all. I'm going to start off kind of by contextualizing this idea and start off a little broad, right? So the climate crisis is the breakdown of systems in which life, societies, and economies all depend. The heating of the world by even 0.5 degree doesn't mean you'll just deal with a little more heat. It means cities and towns will be impacted by devastating climate disasters at more frequent rates. The crop cycles will be altered and therefore food and the economies built around them will be devastated, causing famine and widespread humanitarian crises. It means that the coral reefs will likely die, which have grave implications for biodiversity, as well as communities dependent on them for food and work, which may lead to displacement or migration, and therefore possibility of right-wing backlash or war. These are just a few examples of an infinite number of ways that the breakdown of climate systems will amplify systems of oppression and crises, because climate is very much embedded in the material conditions of life itself. And therefore, any response to the climate crisis must not only just be urgent, but broad. And the closest comparison I can think of is the Industrial Revolution and how it reshaped the economy, society, and day-to-day life. And, just a few years ago, the solutions that were being forwarded were, very neoliberal, gradual, slow. They didn't tackle this entire broad reality of what the climate crisis would be, or it was just outright denial and barbarism. But all of it kind of amounted to barbarism because it only tackled small things through a market-based approach. And I think that the AOC Green New Deal resolution was the first time a solutions-based framework for addressing the climate crisis was thrust into the mainstream. It called for a whole of society 10-year mobilization that creates, millions of good union jobs. It centers racial and economic justice, and it asserted the rights of every person to education, food, water, shelter, healthcare, clean air, a healthy environment, and renewable energy. And as the right often asserted at the time, it was a socialist wish list, and it is. But aside from the overarching vision of a society that puts people and planet before profit, everything was abstract and nothing was actionable. There was no policy or blueprint, so that space was up for grabs. And the vision was too radical, obviously, for neoliberal Democrats and Republicans to embrace, so they rejected it. But liberals and progressives, the left, all clamored towards defining it. And I do think that recent history is interesting, but I'll skip it for now and say that DSA adopted our own principles for the Green New Deal, which came into being through a collaborative, democratic, and bottom-up process led by the Eco-Socialist Working Group. And that broadly captures our vision, and I would recommend that folks read that. So, there's been lots of policies, white papers, and manifestos that have since been introduced with Green New Deal branding. And they've ranged from technological fixes to radical visions like the Red Deal. But here's the thing, I want to be really clear about this. This space held by this concept of a Green New Deal is still largely undefined. So I think it's either a misunderstanding, disingenuous, or defeatist when people write off the Green New Deal as being just like a capitalist policy or whatever. And what I believe is true about the Green New Deal is that it's a terrain of struggle, a struggle in which the victors can potentially enact a new economic and societal relations and therefore class relations during the dawn of a climate change world. And whether that dawn is some form of climate barbarism, international neoliberal world order, or social democracy, or something closer to the eco-socialist Green New Deal principles, will be determined by who has the power to win. And right now, there is a huge vacuum of power at the federal level, and no one has stepped forth to contest the Biden administration as a left flank in a substantial way. But we could, and I think we must. And I think DSA should view the Green New Deal as the best shot and not only sparing the world from the worst ravages of a climate-induced climate apocalypse, but also uniting a working class movement around a shared, largely socialist and justice-oriented vision that can win real material demands and alter the relations of power. And the moral, political, and strategic imperative of that should really honestly not be understated. And I'll also say that my comrade Thea has written beautifully about this concept of the Green New Deal as a terrain of struggle, and I highly recommend that folks read her work on it. And I'll pass it off.
All right, thank you, Sid. And with that, we'll go to Thea.
Should I address that question, or should I?
Yeah, what does the Green New Deal mean to you?
Oh, that's well, I'll just pick up a bit where Sid left off then. I do think of it as a terrain of struggle, and I'll maybe speak a little more to it as we move on. But I think that I completely agree. I think it's like still largely underdefined. And I think that most like ordinary people in the US don't actually know what it means. And that means that there is a really big opening for socialists to define it. But I think that, and that's like a starting point, right? And then the sort of, how do you reach people where they are at and define things in ways that simultaneously resonate with the people that we want to organize, like the people not currently in DSA, the broader working class constituencies that we want to organize, that simultaneously resonate with them, but also open up and push against their horizons of
Thanks, Matt. So basically, I agree with what Thea and Sid said. A lot of my understanding of the Green New Deal is shaped by conversations with these comrades. So obviously, kind of sort of to build up on what they've said is that I think part of the way to look at the Green New Deal and the fact that it's a terrain of struggle is to look at all these iterations of the Green New Deal coming out right now. So it's not a federal legislation. It's probably going to be multiple pieces of federal bills. There's a municipal level to it. There's also a state level to it, right? So these are all different levels of the same thing. So ultimately, it's a concept, and what we're going to win is depending on how we organize and what we organize for. So to understand what the Green New Deal is, you really need to get to what Tia said. It's like the material basis of people's lives. And because, as some of my favorite authors have said, all politics are climate politics in this decade. So, the Green New Deal can encompass a lot of things, from housing justice to even abolitionist organizing, right? And I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about it, but I think I'm going to stop there.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Great answers. Okay. Our next question. So as eco-socialists, we understand both the urgency of the planetary crisis we're in and the truly transformative level of change necessary to stave off planetary ecological collapse and climate catastrophe. How can we hold these ideas at the same time and ensure they're reflected in the strategy of our Green New Deal organizing? Thea, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm happy to start here because I definitely have taken the role of like the annoying optimistic person. And I think it is, you know, it can be an annoying kind of affect because obviously things are extremely bleak. And I think that like the reality of that, even for folks not working on the climate crisis for many years, even for people just kind of learning about it now, it's clear that it's extremely scary, extremely heavy. And also I want to emphasize, in case it needs to be emphasized, like extremely present. That doesn't mean it's present equally for all people. We know that the climate crisis is a burden that is felt very unequally across race, class, and geography. But it is like a foreboding present. It is like the thick reality that we live in right now. And in that kind of context, it can feel really disjointed to even have like the basic level of what I would think of as a kind of faith that you need for organizing. Like you need to believe that things can be different. That can sometimes require a leap of faith. It's really hard to sustain that in this moment of accelerating climate crisis. And I think just to kind of like put a little more of an edge on it, I think that what makes that bleak reality worse for socialists is that despite the fact that as an organization and as a movement, we have grown like way more dramatically in my lifetime than I ever would have predicted, we as socialists are not anywhere as powerful as we need to be in order to like politically enact a radical Green New Deal. And so we have this gap between where we are as DSA and where we need to be politically to implement an eco-socialist program in this extremely urgent time frame. And that gap combined with that urgency is really frustrating. And it leads many, as Sid already discussed, to kind of be seduced by nihilism. And that's really like the easy, it's an understandable thing to do. And I don't want to sort of like reject where people's first reaction to the climate crisis, but I also think it's an easy thing to do. And we can't afford that at all in terms of the climate or politically. And I just want to note before giving like kind of my spin on this contradiction, I just want to note that gap between where we are politically as DSA and where we need to be to implement socialism is present in all of our struggles. It's not like unique to the climate crisis, except the climate crisis has this added layer of intensity and urgency for all the reasons that Sid laid out at the beginning of our first question. So how do we hold this contradictory, the bleakness, the intensity, the acceleration of the climate crisis, and the like necessity for deep transformation? And I think, you know, as always, we kind of sharpen our dialectics whenever we encounter a difficult contradiction. And for me, that means being like real materialists. And I guess I mean that in a few different senses, and I'll kind of just list them quickly so I can, you know, hear what my other comrades have to say. But what does it mean to be dialectical and materialist when we approach this contradiction? One, I think it means just like really confronting the truth and the reality of the climate science. And I don't mean this in an annoying liberal, like believe the science way, but just like we need to understand what's going on. We can't sugarcoat it, and we can't think that there are easy technological fixes as much as technology is obviously part of the solutions that we need to deploy. Second, and Sid got to this, but every fraction of a degree of warming we can prevent saves lives, communities, ecosystems. Nihilism is actually scientifically nonsensical because it's not as if nothing would matter or nothing can be done. In fact, everything that is done to prevent degrees of warming is incredibly consequential for human society. A third thing that I think we should accept, and this is a more positive one, is that climate politics isn't a political taboo. The vast majority of people accept that it's real, that it's human cause, and even that government should do something about it. The fourth, which I won't dwell on because we already talked about it, is that the terrain of the Green New Deal remains relatively open. It's only begun to be defined, and I absolutely don't think it's been fully co-opted, and we can argue about that. But you know, there's attempts at co-optation, but I don't think they're fully successful. Fifth, I'm almost near the end of this list. Fifth, we can't achieve transformation alone. And this is a little controversial in DSA, but I think that we need to think carefully and strategically about how to do coalition work with the labor movement, with other allies, in social movements and also with elected, hopefully DSA members, right? And how do we actually act in coalition to address and confront this enormous planetary problem without ever relinquishing our power or the power of our class? And I guess like the last piece that I would say is that we don't go from zero to eco-socialism overnight. And I think it's that transitional space that can be difficult for many of us to deal with, because revolution is attractive and like disruptive, instantaneous change is attractive, but this is going to be a slog. We need to accept that, and we need to therefore be very scientific in our methods, like develop theories of power grounded in political and climate realities that we deploy and structure test and then revise them as they don't work, and then repeat the things that do work, and kind of, again, like think of politics scientifically, and admit when things don't work, but also claim our victories where we can. And the last thing is just that there's no, for me, even sense like on a feeling level, an emotional level of hope, let alone political hope, without collectivity. And I actually feel the best, or the least bad, maybe is a better way to put it, when I'm like literally in a meeting with eco-socialist comrades, right? And so I think just like throwing yourself into the work is the best way to kind of deal with that intense contradiction of crisis and the necessity of change.
All right, thank you, Thea. Nafis, you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. Thea covered it so well. I'm just going to like say that all those points she listed out are just so great. I don't know how to like follow up on that, except I'd probably add that, the concept of hope that people talk about a lot, and I think this is where like some of abolitionist organizing is very important for eco-socialists, is that hope is not just like something that you can use to postpone your actions, but it's like a practice, as Maria Makaba says. And I think that's something that we should think about integrating into our eco-socialist organizing as well, because the challenge in front of us is so steep, it's so immense, and there's always like so many people who jump on the opportunity to denigrate what we're doing or what we're aiming for, or just like they have the luxury of being nihilists and without facing the immediate consequences. For example, I think there was this like really bad essay I read by a prominent white author who was bemoaning how there's nothing to be done anymore. But that person lives in America, right? And for people in Bangladesh, like where I'm from, that concept doesn't even exist, because every day is a struggle to like live in a warming climate where the floods are increasing. There's the window in which like dengue fever endemics occur in that region is widening because of climate crisis. So like this sort of questions like, we even want to entertain these things, is a choice, right? We can either choose to like consume a lot of media, which is obviously showing how bad things are, which is true, but also you can also focus on what we can do right now. Like that's why, again, imagining the Green New Deal that can take place at like different levels of organizing, right? It doesn't always have to be like federal, right? That you can lobby for city council stuff. That is also important because it gives you sort of it gives you agency, and it gives you power and ways to build with your comrades that ultimately you can practice building up hope through your actual material work. I just want to clarify that when I say your, I also mean our, because I am part of the organizing movement, hopefully.
I know it's coming to me, and I'll just say I am so grateful to have such brilliant comrades who said everything already so beautifully, and I wholeheartedly agree with. And maybe I can emphasize a few points very quickly and just say what Nafis said about hope. Hope is enacted through collective action. I think it's so important for us to hold on to that and really ground that, as Theo was saying, in the material conditions when we take a sober look around the world and really assess what it's going to take to move forward and build the power we need to make change. Hold on to that hope and hold on to that collective action, because we are going to need it, because it's going to be a long ride. But I otherwise don't have anything substantive to add, because I have brilliant comrades who already covered it.
All right. Great responses. So our next question is, a Green New Deal is vast in scale, national or even international. How can we organize and connect struggles at WTO organizing from the local way up to the international? Nafis?
Yeah, I think, that's something that I think about a lot, especially connecting my work here, because I don't live in my home country anymore. But, I'm always like reading the news and what's happening there, and just always like we need to, like, this is a planetary crisis, right? So how do we enact that? But part of it is also like where I am and what I can do to enact that change matters. And I think there are a couple of things I want to mention. The first of all is fighting for free tech transfers for climate technology, right? So that's something that's like, if you're in the global north, that's something you should definitely be demanding as part of a radical Green New Deal. The second thing is to push the West to forgive, and their institutions to forgive sovereign debt that a lot of developing countries have as part of climate reparations. If anything that we have learned from recent history is that a majority of the material wealth that the global north has is based on exploitation of the global south, and it's continuing to do so, especially when a Green New Deal is only imagined to be within the boundaries of the current capitalist system, right? So, and I think we might get to this later, but there's also, with the increase in investments in renewable energy, through market mechanisms, there's going to be more extraction and mining in countries which are already owe a lot of debt to the global north, right? The other thing is that and I think I might mispronounce his name, but Max Agel wrote, like, really, he is a very strong proponent of the global peasant movement, and groups like La Via Campesina have been doing really great work in terms of like reclaiming food and land sovereignty. And I think connecting up with these struggles is very important. The other thing is like building solidarity networks. And I think the DSA International Committee has started to do or is already actually doing some really great work in that arena, building connections with political parties in Latin America right now, and also in New Zealand, I believe that was recent development. And I think these are just like, we're planting seeds of solidarity, right? But that's not going to be enough. But we have to be able to nurture them throughout, over the next decade, for us to be able to stand in solidarity. The other thing that is not talked about a lot is how do we deal, or how do we, address the problem of climate refugees? There is going to be mass migration. Even within the United States, there is going to be a lot of internal migration. So to be able to understand how the carceral state, or like the prison or the military industrial complex plays into climate politics is going to be very important to be able to take the Green New Deal to an international level of struggle. I think I'll stop there.
All right, Sydney, you want to take this next?
Sure. Agree with what my comrade said. And first, I just want to emphasize the fact that it is of the utmost importance as a socialist movement that we have an internationalist perspective, especially in the 21st century, dealing with the climate crisis, because there is going to be, as crisis, deepens, as we've seen already, there is going to be a push towards, or a fracturing of the working class towards like a nationalist, white supremacist agenda or ideology. And we have to hold firm on an internationalist socialist perspective and draw a broad working class movement inward towards that ideology. And we have to be proactive about it. Everything that Nafis said is I wholeheartedly agree with. I would say that there is a lot to think about as far as assessing like global mechanisms of trade and how the capitalist economy works, but I will also refer to my comrade Thea, who is brilliant on this subject. And I just kind of, given that I'm referring to Thea expertise on this, also want to mention that we are within the heart of the imperialist beast, and it cannot be understated how much the US has undermined climate negotiations and reparations and really driven some of like the most neoliberal, horrid, and devastating policies across the globe. And we have a responsibility to fight back, and we cannot allow the U.S. to do this and use the impetus of climate crisis to further decimate communities and countries in the global South. As Nafis said earlier, we have to take climate reparations seriously. I also think we are going to have to think a lot about land and property and the way that we are in relation to migration and the way that it is distributed, and how people are going to get basic necessities. That is something we have to think seriously about as socialists, and making sure that it is people prioritized over property. And yeah, I think we have to really take seriously contesting the US on its warpok path. And we need to build the power to do that. And with that, I'll pass it over to Thea.
Great answers, and super important question, because I think that both the climate crisis and other forms of environmental crisis and the Green New Deal, or whatever we want to call like the holistic transformative approach to deal with those crises, which, noting that like the Green New Deal as language may not resonate everywhere in the world, right? Because it refers to a US-based policy paradigm and history in the New Deal. But whatever we want to call it, both of those happen at every scale, like from the local to national, regional, and planetary. And so we should think broadly. And I want to just pick up on one point that both Nafis and Sid mentioned, which is this piece about supply chains, which is something I've been thinking a lot about. And, just as the climate crisis is planetary, so too is the mode of production of capitalism, right? Like capitalism is how currently all of technologies and infrastructures are produced. And that means that when we are thinking about solar panels that we're going to deploy, or lithium batteries, or electric vehicles, or whatever the green technology is that a Green New Deal would massively sort of scale up, we're talking about things that are produced by global supply chains, which to me is not in and of itself a problem. I'm not like an isolationist. I don't think that everything needs to be produced like within our borders. And that's a bigger and different conversation, but it is the current reality. The problem with that is that these supply chains are extremely unequal, just like everything else in global capitalism. And one of the main ways they're unequal, or I guess two ways. One has to do with the super exploitation and cheapening of labor beyond our borders. But it also has to do with what some people call unequal ecological exchange, that there are places in the world that bear the ecological cost of production, and that they also don't see the benefits of that technology, right? And we see that very clearly right now in certain ways with the vaccine, with many places in the world being denied this innovation. The same thing happens with green technologies that are produced out of the blood, sweat, and tears and dispossessed land in many cases of indigenous peoples and other marginalized people around the world. So what does that mean? Does that mean, and some people have said the following, that like a Green New Deal is like inherently not just capitalist, but imperialist, because it relies on global supply chains that harm people elsewhere in the world. And for me, I think that, we need to confront that reality, but take it as an opportunity to do a couple of things. And I'll just say two of them now. One is to think through what type of Green New Deal or what type of energy transition would involve the least resource extraction, would involve like the least pressure on ecosystems and people's territory, where we'd have to pull the least lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths, et cetera, out of the ground, and sort of think about resource intensity as one way that we evaluate better and worse kind of energy transitions, and understand that like the green capitalist kind of version of the energy transition that we're living through right now is the most resource intensive possible, and therefore like the most pressure on places where those supply chains are located. And then the second kind of resonates with what both Sid and Nafis were saying at the end, which is that we should think of those supply chains not just as like the imposition of capitalism, which they are, but also just like the workplace, like they are workplaces, right? Like mines are workplaces, the communities around them are part of social reproduction, the factories where all of these technologies are made are workplaces. Like that means as socialists, we regard them as like organizing possibilities, and as internationalists as possibilities for international solidarity and thinking of supply chains potentially. And this is like, not something that's been fully enacted in practice yet, but I think DSA should start thinking about it. Like, how might those supply chains actually guide the types of solidarity relations that we weave together? Because it would be extremely powerful if there were multiple organized constituencies, workers, communities at different critical choke points of these supply chains that could in some way coordinate together. And again, this is like a little avant-garde, but I think it is like where we need to be thinking in terms of what it might mean to have internationalism that's not just like symbolic solidarity, but actually gets into like the material guts of the economy and uses those locations as points of leverage and internationalism. So I'll leave it there with that huge thought.
Wait, Matt, can I just add something real quick to what Thea said?
Absolutely.
Sorry, so I just wanted to give like a very material example of what Thea was saying, and I think, you know, as a lot of us might already know how much what a carbon emitter the U.S. military is, and if we look at how much funding goes in there, and to distribute or like, you know, sell weapons and provide military aid and stuff like that. And a really good intersection that we have observed in the recent past is the BDS movement, where, you know, Italian dock workers refused to load ships that was destined to go to the Israeli military. And I think, you know, this has happened multiple times in history as well. So I think when you think about like choke points and the global supply chain system, building solidarity, really, you can sort of organize around those areas as well. Yeah, I'm just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, thank you. Next question. Is there a role for non-legislative campaigns in our DSA Green New Deal organizing? If so, what is it? Sydney?
Well, my answer is yes. If you've ever been in like a Green New Deal or eco-socialist meeting with me in the past 4 years, you've probably heard me utter the phrase that climate change is class war. And I believe that is true. And to win the class war, we have to build a massive multiracial, internationalist, working class movement that can and does contest and overpower the capitalist class. And I think the electoral and legislative arena is, you know, those are only one sphere of struggle for that. And while I strongly believe that the urgency of the climate crisis demands an orientation towards federal politics, I do not believe that is the only sphere in which we must struggle, because class struggle is happening everywhere and the climate is just the context of which this is happening. And it's not a secret either that I believe strongly that the workers are agents of change, and that is specifically because workers have the ability to disrupt and halt the means of production and make demands based on their capacity, their unique capacity to do that. And therefore, that is an important choke point, as Thea was saying earlier, everywhere. And therefore, we have to be organizing as workers. And that's not to say that's the only arena either. I think we can struggle in our communities, in our apartment buildings, and other arenas as well. But I do think, as far as like non-legislative campaigns go, we need to organize as workers. And for the sake of time and getting to other questions, I will pass it on to my comrades.
I just want to say like one very quick thing here, because I think Sid covered it, and I love the phrase about, you know, thinking about climate as class war and all of the different venues in which class war unfolds. And I want to maybe even like push back a little bit against the framing of the question. No shade on the question writer, but I think even a legislative campaign involves non-legislative tactics if it's going to be successful, right? So I even want to kind of disentangle, because I think that there's a perception, and we've been debating this in different convention fora, right? This is like an ongoing conversation within a cost convention around like, especially when we're thinking about national work, like, is it merely like a pressure campaign on Congress? Are we just like, you know, writing letters to our congressperson and saying, please, will you do this? Is that all that legislative pressure, like legislative campaigns involve? And I think, you know, with the PRO Act, we began to show, and we're going to keep building on that with the Green New Deal for public schools, that like actually, you know, maybe, you know, legislation might be the desired or one of the desired outcomes, right? But that doesn't mean that the only place that the struggle takes place is like Congress, right? In fact, exactly as Sid said, in order to have any leverage over an entity like Congress, you need to be organizing in ways that exceed like the sort of parliamentary tactics. And I think kind of articulating and thinking about how extra parliamentary and parliamentary tactics connect to one another to push forward legislative and also other goals is kind of like where we need to be at as eco-socialists. And honestly, like what I've learned from like revolutionary left-wing movements in Latin America is it's about that articulation of the parliamentary and the extra parliamentary. Even if, again, your goal is getting a socialist elected, you need to have a show of force that goes beyond votes, right? And so, you know, we can talk about this more and it's a bigger conversation, but I just want to say that like, even legislative campaigns don't just involve purely legislative tactics if they're going to be successful, but certainly not all of our campaigns even have only legislative goals.
Nafis, do you have anything to
add? Sure, I'll just add a little bit. And I think there was a question from the audience about suggested strategies on pairing up G&D efforts with regional mutual aid and disaster response efforts. I think I'll try to answer a little bit of both at the same time. To that end, you know, I think there's always this debate in DSA about, oh, are we just going to do electoral work, or are you going to do like anti-eviction work or mutual aid? And I don't think those are like, you know, mutually exclusive, right? The best example I can give you from recent history is when the Texas freeze happened, right? A lot of our comrades in Houston rolled out mutual aid efforts. But that also, you know, got people thinking about an energy democracy campaign, which, you know, as Theo was mentioning, that it's not necessarily only writing letters to Congress people, but also organizing people in quote unquote non-legislative manners to bring about the, you know, to materialize what we are demanding, right? They're just not gonna, just because you write a bill doesn't mean that they're just gonna hand over control over energy production to us. We have to be out in the streets demanding it and putting pressure on them, right? And that doesn't only mean that we just march to a congressman's office. That also means opposing fossil fuel infrastructure, which is why fighting pipelines is like a very important, you know, organizing activity. The other thing I want to mention is that in terms of overall eco-socialist organizing, there are two points I want to raise. One is, you know, there's so much overlap between prison abolition work and eco-socialist organizing. And the main example I'm going to give is all the firefighters out in California who are actually incarcerated and they have to be paid, right? And because of their service and because of the nature of their work, last year, Gavin Newsom passed, you know, signed into law saying that their records are going to be expunged if they serve in it. But when you think about it, like, you know, these people who are incarcerated, they have to risk their lives to be able to prove, to fight like a climate crisis, which is caused by people who are, you know, like all of us in general in the global north, right? So giving them that opportunity could lead to building like a firefighting corps, right? So I think that there was a candidate, Jackie Fielder, right? So she ran on a similar platform for that. The other one is the anti-border work. So this group, No More Deaths, who were leaving water for migrants in the border, that is also eco-socialist work and could be part of the Green New Deal. Is like, how do you help climate refugees move into areas where they can have a better life because their countries are, you know, decimated, or their countries are in a lot of strife because of active involvement from the global north. And, you know, any Latin American comrade can attest to like the level of involvement that the US has had in those countries, right? So.
I think we'll do an audience question. Let me see these right here. So, do any of you think to be effective, a Green New Deal has to include bolder proposals like a people's seizure of the energy industry, rationing the use of fossil fuels, protecting older growth forests, and rewinding much of the globe, the only effective form of carbon capture? That is an audience question. Anyone want to take that one?
I'll take an initial stab at it, and I'm actually like very curious what Nafisa and Sid have to say, and to see if there's any debate over this. I think that a lot hinges on the word effective, right? So like the comrade is asking, in order to be effective, do we need to have bolder proposals? And I think by bolder, the comrade means like more transformative, like more change in the status quo. And I think on the one hand, the answer to that is obviously yes. And I don't mean that to be flippant. Like in order to stave off like the level of disaster that again Sid outlined at the beginning of the call of this panel, and also what Nafis said about the reality of like living in Bangladesh and what the like everyday consequences are, right? Like we have those in mind. And so in order to confront that, we need to do some dramatic things. But I think, that's one way to think of the word effective. And the other way to think about it is as organizers, right? Like what is the effective way to get masses of working class people to recognize their own agency and like become involved as like a collective subject in this process of transformative change? And is it true that saying we need immediate peace seizure of the energy system, which is the first example in the comrade's question, would simply saying that like call into being the collective agent that's going to make that possible, right? So I want to put like a little bit of distance between what on one level might be more effective in terms of like the climate science and what needs to be done, but always needing to sort of match that with what our organizing capacities are, who the groups are that we're trying to help empower and activate, and like what tactics will lead from point A to point B. Because I think that, as a lot of our comrades that are involved in public power campaigns, which is maybe a less bold thing than what the question asks for, but regardless is about public takeover of the energy system, have learned that they are amazing campaigns and I'm a huge proponent of them, but there are also some like difficulties to them. Like you have to deal with all of these like bureaucracies and technocratic stuff and jargon and even understanding the energy system. So simply saying we need a people's energy system, it can make a beautiful poster. And I mean that like seriously, I'm like a comms person. I love a beautiful poster, right? But it may not tell you what actual strategy would realize that. And if we get too, I think, fixated on what the most like total effective solution would be, then I think we get seduced by not actually thinking through the process of organizing to get there. And for me, that organizational process is much more important to like dig into than like the specific like, bold top line, idea that we have of what a better reality might look like. But my 2 cents. I don't know what, I want to hear what Sid and Nafis have to say.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, I was gonna say I was gonna say something very similar to Thea in that yes, we need to be making those types of things, yes, to be more effective. And what is effective is our capacity to build power, right? That is what makes us effective. Is if we wield power and build power, we are effective. We only have the power to win what we can. So that's kind of the framework I think is the most important to work in. That doesn't mean that we compromise and we like are defeatist and say we cannot win these things. No, it means that we have a responsibility to build the power to win those things. And like Thea was saying, I don't want to get lost in the policy details of things to the extent that we neglect actually building the movement that can win them. And so, yes, you are right. And yes, let us build the power to do it.
Nafis?
Yeah, I mean, Thea and Sid really nailed it. I think I'm just going to summarize by saying that bold ideas are definitely needed. We need to have the vision, but also we need to be careful about how to organize around that vision, or like what we want to prioritize first. That doesn't mean that we aren't going to be doing it, but it's just a matter of how do you build a campaign around it. And I think I'm just really so proud to be part of the Green New Deal campaign committee and Eco-Socialist working group, because my comrades and our comrades have sort of figured it out, like how to, get really down to a demand and build a campaign around it, which is visionary, right? And there's these levels that you build on it. Like first we want to win worker power, then we want to go to public schools, and then we have more bold visions. And to go back to one of Thea's points about public power, it sounds amazing, right? We're all like, yes, we want public power. But I've been a part of a public power campaign for like a few years now. And I can tell you, it is really a lot of just like fighting with bureaucratic and technocratic language and figuring out what is the best way to do it, because a lot of these issues that we're dealing with right now are not very political per se. Energy is not a political issue. Only the production is. Yes, we all understand that more extraction of oil and gas is definitely like something that it's easy to organize people around, like anti-fracking or like opposing pipelines. But how do you build a campaign around people who just want their electricity to not go out, right? And how do you give it back to the hands of the people? It's just, we have to be very strategic in thinking about like what's our priorities here.
Absolutely. Thank you. Myself real quick. How should y'all get more folks think about the Green New Deal as a priority over time? I encourage you to check out on Thursday, if you're a convention delegate, we'll be presenting the Green New Deal campaign committee report. I think Ashik will be doing that. And whether or not you see that, I encourage you to read the actual report itself. A lot of great comrades spent a lot of time on that, and it really lays out in detail how we went from Sydney organizing a couple meetups at the 2017 convention to the Green New Deal campaign as a priority and the PRO Act and everything we have today. So we have about 2 minutes left and we have a hard stop. And I just want to thank you all for watching this panel. And I want to thank our 3 amazing panelists, 3 of the best comrades and friends that I know, bringing the theory and practice of eco-socialism to life, both thinking about things at a level and doing the work.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thanks everybody. I have like legit convention FOMO, but yeah, I just want to put that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here with you all. I'm so glad that you all tuned in too. We've got a world to win, so let's do it. Hope through collective action. Let's get to it.
Yeah.